The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as Sarah clutched her worn leather satchel against her chest. Her feet ached from walking since dawn, and the small town she had left behind was now just a memory on the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly before her, broken only by the occasional cactus and the distant outline of mountains that seemed to mock her with their unreachable promise of shelter. Sarah's stomach growled, reminding her that the last piece of bread she had eaten was yesterday morning. The water in her canteen sloshed with only a few precious drops remaining. She had been walking for 3 days now, ever since she had gathered the courage to leave the life that had brought her nothing but pain and disappointment. Her husband's funeral had been the final straw, not because she mourned him, but because it had finally freed her from the prison of their loveless marriage. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Sarah's heart race. She turned to see a lone rider emerging from the heat shimmer, his silhouette growing larger against the blazing sky. As he drew closer, she could make out his weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes sharp and assessing as they took in her disheveled appearance. The horse beneath him was a magnificent chestnut mare, well cared for and strong, a stark contrast to Sarah's own sorry state. The rider slowed his horse to a walk as he approached, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. She noticed the way his hands rested easily on the reins, the confident set of his shoulders, and the way he seemed to belong to this harsh landscape in a way she never could. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You look lost, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "This isn't exactly the kind of country for walking alone." Sarah straightened her shoulders, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "I'm heading to town," she replied, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "I can manage on my own. Thank you." The stranger's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, not with mockery, but with something that might have been understanding. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Up close, Sarah could see the lines that sun and wind had carved into his face, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, and the way his clothes, though dusty from travel, were well made and cared for. "The name's Jake Morrison," he said, offering his hand. "I own the Three Rivers Ranch about 5 miles north of here, and town is still a good 20 miles east through some of the roughest country in these parts." Sarah hesitated before taking his hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip despite the obvious strength in his fingers. "Sarah," she said simply, not offering her last name. She had left her married name behind with everything else from her old life. Jake studied her for a moment, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on her frame, and the determined set of her jaw despite her obvious exhaustion. "When did you last eat?" he asked quietly. The question caught Sarah off guard, and she felt tears threatening to spill over before she blinked them back. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice wavered, betraying her. "No, you're not," Jake said matter-of-factly, without judgment. "And you won't make it to town in your condition. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and walking alone without proper supplies is a big one." Sarah wanted to argue, to maintain her independence, but her body betrayed her as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Jake's hand shot out to steady her, his touch warm and reassuring. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into his strength before pulling away, ashamed of her weakness. "Will you take me to town?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The plea in her voice made her cringe inwardly, but desperation had stripped away her pride. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to read the story written there. Sarah felt exposed under his gaze, certain he could see through her carefully constructed facade to the broken woman underneath. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but not unkind. "I'll take you where you need to go," he said slowly, "but you'll stay at my place tonight. You need food, rest, and water before you go anywhere else. The desert has already taken too much out of you." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She had spent too many years under a man's roof, following a man's rules, to willingly put herself in that position again. But as another wave of weakness washed over her, she realized she had little choice. The alternative was likely dying alone on this desolate road, and she had come too far to give up now. "I don't have money to pay you," she admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. Jake's expression softened slightly. I'm not asking for payment. Sometimes folks need help, and sometimes those who can help have an obligation to do so. He moved to his horse and pulled a water canteen from his saddle, offering it to Sarah. The water was warm but clean, and she forced herself to drink slowly despite the overwhelming urge to drain the entire container. Jake watched her with those perceptive eyes, and she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. "Can you ride?" he asked as she handed back the canteen. Sarah nodded, though it had been years since she had been on a horse. Her father had taught her when she was young, before life had taken a series of turns that led her away from such simple pleasures. Jake offered his hand to help her mount, and, after a moment's hesitation, she accepted. The feeling of the horse beneath her was both foreign and familiar, like returning to a half-forgotten dream. Jake swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Sarah tensed at the proximity, memories of her husband's rough hands making her skin crawl, but Jake's touch was different. Respectful. Safe. As they rode toward his ranch, Jake pointed out landmarks and shared bits of information about the country they were crossing. His voice was soothing, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly despite her reservations. The horse's steady gait and the warmth of the sun on her back began to work their magic on her exhausted body. "Why were you walking alone?" Jake asked eventually, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah was quiet for so long that she thought he might ask again, but he simply waited, patient as the desert itself. Finally, she spoke, her words barely audible above the sound of hoofbeats. "I left my husband," she said. "He died 2 weeks ago, and I realized I had no reason to stay in that place anymore. No reason to pretend I was someone I wasn't." Jake's arms tightened slightly around her, not restricting but protective. "Where were you planning to go?" "Anywhere," Sarah replied honestly. "Somewhere I could start over, be myself for the first time in years." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the landscape slowly changing as they approached Jake's property. Sarah could see why he had chosen this place. The land was harsh, but beautiful, with a wild dignity that spoke to something deep inside her. In the distance, she could make out buildings that seemed to grow naturally from the earth itself, as if they belonged there. The Three Rivers Ranch was larger than Sarah had expected, with a main house that was both imposing and welcoming, surrounded by corrals, barns, and smaller outbuildings. Men moved about their work with the easy efficiency of those who knew their jobs well, and several looked up with curiosity as Jake rode in with a passenger. Jake dismounted first, then helped Sarah down, his hands steady on her waist as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. The world spun slightly, and she gripped his forearms until it settled. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe now." The words hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had told her she was safe? When was the last time she had actually felt it? She blinked back tears as Jake guided her toward the house, his hand warm and steady on her back. The interior of the house surprised her with its comfort and cleanliness. This was clearly a man's domain, but it was well cared for, with touches that spoke of someone who took pride in his home. Jake led her to a chair in the main room and disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, returning with a glass of cool water and a plate of bread and cheese. "Eat slowly," he advised, settling into a chair across from her. "Your stomach needs time to remember what food is for." Sarah wanted to devour the simple meal, but she forced herself to follow his advice, taking small bites and sipping the water carefully. Jake watched her with those penetrating eyes, and she found herself wondering what he was thinking. Was he judging her for her circumstances? Pitying her? The thought made her uncomfortable, but his expression revealed nothing except patient concern. "You mentioned 3 rivers," she said eventually, needing to break the silence. "Is that where the ranch gets its name?" Jake nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My father chose this place because 3 streams converge just north of here. He said water was life in country like this, and a man who controlled water controlled his destiny." "Was he right?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "In some ways," Jake replied thoughtfully. "Water is important, but it's not everything. Land, cattle, good men to work with you, understanding the country, and respecting it. All of that matters too." Sarah could hear the love he had for this place in his voice, and something inside her stirred in recognition. She had never felt that way about anywhere in her life, but she thought she understood what it might feel like. As the afternoon wore on, Jake showed her to a guest room where she could rest and clean up. The room was simple but comfortable, with a wash basin and fresh water, clean towels, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Her face was thinner than it had been, marked by exhaustion and the stress of recent events. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there when she lived with her husband. A spark of determination, perhaps, or the first glimmer of hope. She looked like a woman who had made a choice and was prepared to live with the consequences. That evening, Jake invited her to join him for dinner. The meal was simple but delicious: beef stew with vegetables from his garden, fresh bread, and coffee that was stronger than anything she was used to. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, but Sarah found herself stealing glances at her host, trying to understand this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. After dinner, they sat on the front porch as the sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The desert air was cooling, and Sarah wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Jake noticed and disappeared briefly, returning with a thick blanket that he draped over her legs. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than just gratitude for the blanket. Jake nodded, understanding. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said. "But I suspect you're not the type to stay anywhere you don't want to be." Sarah looked at him sharply, surprised by his insight. "What makes you think that? A woman doesn't walk alone through the desert unless she's running from something or toward something. Either way, it takes strength most people don't have." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the absence of conflict that she had known in her marriage, born of fear and submission, but true peace that came from being exactly where she was supposed to be at that moment. When she finally retired for the night, Sarah lay in the comfortable bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow, Jake would take her to town as promised, and she would have to figure out what came next in her life. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build on. Sarah woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, the unfamiliar surroundings causing her heart to race until the events of the previous day came flooding back. Sunlight streamed through the window, telling her she had slept later than she intended. The bed was more comfortable than any she had known in years, and her body felt more rested than it had in months. She dressed quickly in her worn traveling clothes, running her fingers through her hair in an attempt to make herself presentable. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the house, making her stomach growl with renewed hunger. When she emerged from her room, she found Jake already up and moving around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself. "Good morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," Sarah admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her. The brew was strong and hot, chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. Jake had prepared a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were still warm from the oven. Sarah marveled at his competence in the kitchen, so different from her husband who had expected to be waited on hand and foot. As they ate, Jake outlined his plans for the day. "I need to check on some cattle in the north pasture this morning," he said. "After that, I can take you into town if you're still set on going." Sarah nodded, though something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "You don't think I should go?" It wasn't a question, and Jake didn't treat it like one. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. "What I think is that you're running from something, but you haven't figured out what you're running to yet." His words hit closer to home than Sarah was comfortable with, and she found herself looking away. "I need to make my own way in the world. I can't do that hiding out on your ranch." "Who says you'd be hiding?" Jake asked mildly. "There's plenty of work here for someone willing to do it." The suggestion caught Sarah off guard. She had expected him to be eager to see her gone, to return to his solitary life without the complications her presence brought. "You don't know anything about me," she said carefully. "I could be a thief, or worse." Jake's smile was genuine and warm. "Could be, but thieves don't usually walk themselves half to death in the desert, and they don't look at a man the way you do when he offers help." "How do I look at you?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "Like you're afraid I might turn out to be as bad as whatever you left behind, Jake said gently, but also like you hope I might not be. The accuracy of his observation made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. She had spent so many years learning to read the moods and intentions of her husband, watching for the signs that would tell her whether she faced a beating or merely harsh words. The habit of wariness was so ingrained that she couldn't imagine living without it. I was married to a man who believed wives were property, she said quietly, the words coming easier than she had expected. He never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. When he died, I realized I had never learned who I was outside of being his possession. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah saw something dark flash across his features before he controlled it. Some men don't deserve the title, he said simply. They finished breakfast in thoughtful silence, and then Jake led her outside to show her around the ranch. In the bright morning light, the place seemed even more impressive than it had the night before. The buildings were well-maintained and practical, designed by someone who understood both the demands of ranch life and the importance of creating something beautiful in the harsh landscape. Jake introduced her to his foreman, a weather-beaten man named Tom who had worked the ranch for over 20 years. Tom's eyes were kind but shrewd as he took Sarah's measure, and she could see him filing away information about this unexpected guest. The other ranch hands were polite but curious, clearly wondering about the woman their boss had brought home. "Don't mind them," Jake said quietly as they walked between the corrals. "We don't get many visitors out here, especially not women traveling alone." Sarah watched as Jake interacted with his men, noting the easy respect that flowed both ways. These weren't men who worked for him out of fear or desperation, but because they believe in what he was building here. She found herself wondering what it would be like to be part of something like that, to have a place where she belonged and work that mattered. They rode out to check on the cattle. Sarah mounted on a gentle mare that Jake assured her was perfectly safe. The horse responded to her tentative guidance with patience, as if sensing her uncertainty. As they moved across the rangeland, Jake pointed out various features of his property, explaining the challenges and rewards of ranching in this unforgiving country. "The key is working with the land instead of against it," he said, gesturing toward an area where cattle grazed peacefully in the shade of a grove of trees. "My father tried to force this place to be something it wasn't, and he nearly lost everything. I learned to listen to what the country was telling me." Sarah found herself fascinated by his philosophy, so different from her experience with men who believe the world should bend to their will. "How do you listen to the land?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something that had become instinctive to him. "You watch the patterns, where the water flows, where the grass grows best, how the animals move through the seasons. You pay attention to what works and what doesn't, and you adapt accordingly." As they rode, Sarah began to understand what he meant. She could see how the ranch had been laid out to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources, how the grazing areas had been planned to prevent overuse of any single pasture. It was a way of thinking that required patience and humility, qualities that had been beaten out of most men she had known. They found the cattle Jake had been concerned about gathered around a small spring, healthy and content. As Jake dismounted to check on a cow that had been limping the last time he saw her, Sarah remained on her horse, watching him work. His movements were sure and gentle as he examined the animal, talking to her in a low, soothing voice that seemed to calm both the cow and Sarah herself. "She's fine," he announced, straightening up with obvious relief. "Just a stone bruise that's healed up nicely." On the ride back to the house, Sarah found herself reluctant to return. The morning had been peaceful in a way she had forgotten was possible, and the thought of leaving this sanctuary to face an uncertain future in town filled her with dread she tried to hide. Jake seemed to sense her mood. "You could stay," he said quietly as they approached the ranch buildings. "At least until you decide what you really want to do." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain her independence, and continue on the path she had chosen. But something in his tone made her pause. "Why would you want me to stay? You don't know me. I could be more trouble than I'm worth." "Could be," Jake agreed. "But I don't think so. And I could use the help. Mrs. Patterson from town used to come out once a week to do the cooking and cleaning, but she moved to live with her daughter last month. The house has been feeling pretty empty since then." It was a practical offer, but Sarah suspected there was more to it than that. She had seen the way Jake looked at her, with an interest that went beyond simple kindness. The thought both excited and terrified her. She had never been courted properly, had gone from her father's house to her husband's with no say in the matter. The idea of choosing for herself was intoxicating and overwhelming. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly. "To stay anywhere. To trust anyone. To start over." Jake nodded, understanding. "Nobody's asking you to be ready for anything except whatever feels right today. Tomorrow can take care of itself." They ate lunch together on the front porch, watching the ranch hands go about their afternoon duties. Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile as he talked about his plans for expanding the operation, noting the strength in his jaw and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. He was handsome in a weathered, practical way that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with character. "What made you decide to ranch?" she asked during a lull in the conversation. Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I didn't have much choice initially. My father built this place, and when he died, it was mine whether I wanted it or not. But I grew to love it. There's something honest about this life. The land doesn't care who your family is or what mistakes you've made. It only cares whether you're willing to work hard and treat it with respect." Sarah thought about that as they finished their meal. She had never had the chance to discover what she might love, what might make her feel the way Jake obviously felt about his ranch. Her entire adult life had been spent trying to avoid her husband's displeasure rather than pursuing her own interests or dreams. That afternoon, Jake taught her how to help with some of the simpler ranch chores. She learned to gather eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, to milk the cow that provided fresh dairy for the house, and to tend a vegetable garden that supplied much of their food. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, quickly developed blisters, but she found a satisfaction in the physical labor that surprised her. "You're a natural," Jake observed as she successfully coaxed a particularly stubborn chicken to give up its eggs. Sarah laughed, the sound surprising them both. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed with genuine joy rather than nervous appeasement. "I think the chicken might disagree." As evening approached, Sarah realized that Jake had not mentioned taking her to town again. She wondered if he had forgotten his promise or if he was simply waiting for her to bring it up. Part of her was grateful for the delay, but another part felt obligated to remind him. "About going to town," she said as they walked back to the house together. "What about it?" Jake asked, his tone carefully neutral. "You said you would take me today." Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "I did say that, but I also said you could stay as long as you needed. The question is, what do you need, Sarah? Really need, not what you think you should do or what other people would expect." The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah had spent so many years being told what she needed, what she wanted, what she should feel, that the idea of deciding for herself was almost paralyzing. She looked around at the ranch, at the comfortable house, and well-tended gardens, at the man who was watching her with patience, and something that might have been hope. "I don't know," she whispered, the admission painful but liberating. "Then stay until you do know," Jake said simply, "or until you decide you need to leave. Either way, the choice is yours." That evening, they sat together on the front porch again, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sarah felt a peace settling over her that was deeper than anything she had experienced in years. For the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't running from something or desperately trying to figure out her next move. She was simply being present in the moment, and it was enough. "Jake," she said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes. Thank you for giving me the choice." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft in the fading light. "Everyone deserves the right to choose their own path, Sarah, even if it takes time to figure out what that path should be." As the stars began to appear overhead, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. She would stay, at least for now. She would take the time she needed to heal, to discover who she was when she wasn't afraid, to see what might grow between her and this unexpected man who had offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, its voice lonely but not afraid. Sarah pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and allowed herself to imagine a future that was hers to choose. For the first time in her adult life, that future held promise instead of dread. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah made the decision to stay at the Three Rivers Ranch, and the changes in her were remarkable even to herself. Her hands had grown strong and callous from the work. Her face had gained color from the sun, and she had put on weight that filled out her dress in a way that made her feel like a woman rather than a shadow. But the most significant changes were the ones that couldn't be seen. She no longer startled when Jake approached her unexpectedly, no longer flinched when he moved too quickly or spoke with authority to his ranch hands. The constant state of hypervigilance that had defined her married life was slowly giving way to something she had almost forgotten existed: peace of mind. She woke each morning with purpose rather than dread, knowing that the day ahead held meaningful work and the company of a man who treated her as an equal. The ranch work suited her in ways she never would have expected. There was something deeply satisfying about caring for the animals, tending the garden, and maintaining the household that kept Jake and his men fed and comfortable. It wasn't the endless, thankless drudgery she had known in her marriage, where nothing she did was ever quite good enough. Instead, it was work that mattered, work that was appreciated, work that made a tangible difference in the lives of those around her. Jake had proven to be a patient teacher, showing her how to handle the more spirited horses, how to read the weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death in ranch country, and how to manage the household accounts that kept the operation running smoothly. She discovered she had a natural aptitude for numbers, something her husband had never allowed her to explore. "You've got a good head for business," Jake observed one evening as they went over the books together. "Have you ever thought about what you might want to do with that?" Sarah looked up from the ledger where she had been carefully recording the day's expenses, surprised by the question. "I never really thought I had a choice about what to do with any of my abilities." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. "Well, you do now. What interests you?" It was such a simple question, but it opened a floodgate of thoughts and feelings Sarah had kept locked away for years. "I used to love reading," she said slowly, testing the words. "Before I was married, I read everything I could get my hands on. I dreamed of maybe teaching someday or writing stories." "What stopped you?" Sarah's expression darkened. "My husband thought education was wasted on women. He said it gave them ideas above their station. He burned my books the week after we were married." Jake's jaw tightened, and Sarah saw that familiar flash of controlled anger cross his features. "A man who burns books is afraid of what they might teach," he said quietly. "Fear makes people cruel." The simple validation of her loss meant more to Sarah than she could express. No one had ever understood what those books had meant to her, how their destruction had felt like losing pieces of her soul. "I try to remember the stories," she whispered, "in my head when things were bad. Sometimes it was the only way I could escape." Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the touch warm and comforting. "There's a whole shelf of books in the front room. They're yours to read whenever you want. And if you're interested in teaching, the school in town has been looking for someone to help with the younger children." Sarah stared at him in wonder. The idea that she could reclaim that lost part of herself, that she could maybe even make a living doing something she loved, was almost too wonderful to believe. "You really think I could?" "I think you could do anything you set your mind to," Jake said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Stronger than you've been allowed to be." That night, Sarah sat in the front room with a book of poetry in her lap, marveling at the luxury of reading by lamplight without fear of retribution. The words on the page seemed to come alive after so many years of hunger for literature, and she found herself crying over passages that spoke to her battered but healing heart. Jake found her there when he came in from his final check on the animals, tears streaming down her face as she read. "Sarah, what's wrong?" He was beside her in an instant, his face full of concern. She looked up at him, smiling through her tears. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right." I had forgotten how beautiful words could be. Jake's expression softened with understanding. He settled into the chair across from her, content to watch her rediscover this piece of herself. The simple act of being able to read in peace had become a symbol of her freedom, and he seemed to understand its significance without needing explanation. As the days passed, Sarah and Jake fell into a comfortable routine that felt almost like a real partnership. They worked together during the day, shared meals and conversation in the evening, and slowly began to share their histories and dreams. Sarah learned that Jake had once been engaged to a woman from back east who had visited the ranch and declared it too uncivilized for her refined tastes. He had loved her, or thought he had, but her rejection of his life and dreams had taught him that compatibility went deeper than physical attraction. "She wanted me to sell the ranch and move to San Francisco," he told Sarah one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Said I could make good money in business there. Be a gentleman instead of a cowboy." "Why didn't you?" Sarah asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because this is who I am," Jake said simply. "This place is part of me, and I'm part of it." A man who gives up his soul for love isn't much good to anyone, including the woman he thinks he loves. Sarah thought about that as she brushed her hair before bed that night. Her husband had demanded that she give up pieces of herself until there was almost nothing left, but he had never loved her for who she really was. Jake seemed to be encouraging her to discover and reclaim the woman she had always been meant to be. The difference was profound and liberating. The turning point came during the 4th week of her stay, when a violent thunderstorm rolled across the desert with little warning. Sarah was in the garden when the first drops fell, racing to gather the vegetables that would be ruined by hail. The wind picked up suddenly, driving rain horizontally across the yard and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She was struggling with an armload of tomatoes when a gust of wind knocked her off balance. She fell hard, crying out as pain shot through her ankle. The vegetables scattered across the muddy ground as she tried to get up, only to discover that her foot wouldn't bear her weight. Jake appeared out of the storm like an avenging angel, his face white with worry as he saw her on the ground. Without hesitation, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the house, ignoring her protests that she could walk. "Don't be stubborn," he said firmly as he settled her on the sofa and began examining her ankle. "This is swollen pretty badly. You might have broken it." The touch of his hands as he carefully probed the injury was gentle but thorough, and Sarah found herself studying his face as he concentrated on his task. His dark hair was plastered to his head from the rain, and worry lines creased his forehead. When he looked up and caught her watching him, something electric passed between them that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "I don't think it's broken," he said quietly, but he didn't move away from her. "Just a bad sprain. You need to stay off it for a few days." They were very close now, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Her heart began to race, not with fear, but with an emotion she had almost forgotten existed. When Jake reached up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, she didn't pull away. "Sarah," he said softly, her name a question and a prayer all at once. She knew what he was asking, knew that this was a moment that would change everything between them. For so long, physical intimacy had been something to be endured rather than enjoyed, a duty rather than a pleasure. But, looking into Jake's eyes, she saw something she had never seen in a man's face before: tenderness, respect, and a desire that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with genuine caring. "Yes," she whispered, not fully sure what she was agreeing to, but knowing that she trusted this man with her heart and her healing. Jake cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. This was nothing like the rough, demanding kisses she had known from her husband. This was soft and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that asked rather than demanded, that gave rather than took. When they finally broke apart, Sarah was trembling, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment and the realization that this was what she had been missing all her life. This was what love felt like when it was freely given and gratefully received. "I've wanted to do that since the day I found you on that road," Jake admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "I was afraid to want it," Sarah replied honestly. "I wasn't sure I remembered how." Jake pulled back to look at her, his expression serious. "There's no hurry, Sarah. We have all the time in the world to figure this out together." That night, as the storm raged outside and her ankle throbbed with pain, Sarah lay in her bed and thought about the kiss they had shared. For the first time in her adult life, she had been kissed by a man who cared more about her pleasure than his own, who saw her as a partner rather than a possession. The realization filled her with a joy so intense, it was almost frightening. She thought about her journey from that desperate woman walking alone in the desert to this moment of possibility and hope. She had traveled much farther than the physical distance between her old life and Jake's ranch. She had journeyed from despair to hope, from fear to trust, from survival to the possibility of truly living. Outside her window, lightning illuminated the desert landscape in brilliant flashes, revealing a world transformed by the storm. Sarah smiled in the darkness, understanding that she too had been transformed by the storms in her life. The woman who had begged for a ride to town was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and ready to claim the love and happiness she had never dared to dream possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new choices. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sarah fell asleep with a smile on her face and hope in her heart. She was home. 2 months had passed since the storm that changed everything between Sarah and Jake. Her ankle had healed completely, but the emotional transformation that began that night continued to unfold with each passing day. The tentative relationship that had blossomed from their first kiss had grown into something deeper and more complex than either of them had expected. Jake proved to be as patient a lover as he was a teacher, understanding instinctively that Sarah needed time to unlearn years of conditioning that had taught her to fear physical intimacy. Their courtship unfolded slowly, built on moments of tenderness that gradually rebuilt Sarah's trust in her own desires and her right to experience pleasure and affection. They would sit together in the evenings, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes simply enjoying comfortable silence as they watched the stars emerge over the desert. Jake would reach for her hand or brush his fingers through her hair, small gestures of affection that meant more to Sarah than grand romantic declarations. These quiet moments of connection were teaching her what it meant to be cherished rather than merely tolerated. The ranch hands had quickly adjusted to Sarah's permanent presence, treating her with the same respectful familiarity they showed Jake. Tom, the foreman, had become particularly protective of her, often going out of his way to help with tasks that might be too physically demanding. The younger men sought her advice on everything from mending torn shirts to writing letters home to their families. And Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial heart of the ranch community. "You've brought something special to this place," Tom told her one morning as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by the recent storm. "Haven't seen Jake this happy since I've known him, and that's going on 25 years. Sarah paused in her work, looking across the pasture where Jake was working with a particularly stubborn horse. Even from a distance, she could see the easy confidence in his movements, the way he communicated with the animal through patience and understanding rather than force. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "Best I've ever worked for," Tom agreed. "But he's been lonely. Man needs more than work and cattle to make a life complete. He needs someone who understands what this place means to him, someone who can be a true partner." The conversation stayed with Sarah as she went about her daily tasks. She had begun to understand that what she and Jake were building together was more than just a romantic relationship. They were creating a partnership that encompassed every aspect of their lives, from the practical matters of running the ranch to the deeper questions of what they wanted their future to look like. That understanding was put to the test when Jake's younger brother Michael arrived unexpectedly from Denver, bringing with him the complications of family history and different expectations. Michael was everything Jake was not: polished, citified, and convinced that his older brother was wasting his life on a remote ranch when he could be making real money in business. Michael's arrival created an immediate tension that Sarah felt but didn't fully understand until Jake explained their history over dinner that first night. "Michael thinks I'm crazy for staying out here," Jake said after his brother had retired to the guest room. "He's been trying to convince me to sell the ranch for years. Says I could make a fortune with the land values going up." "And you've never been tempted?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake shook his head firmly. "This land isn't just an investment to me. It's my responsibility, my heritage. My father and grandfather put their lives into building something here that would last. I can't just throw that away for money." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. She had come to love the ranch as much as Jake did, not just for its beauty, but for what it represented: stability, purpose, a place where a person could build something meaningful with their own hands. Michael's opinion of Sarah became clear during breakfast the next morning when he began what he obviously considered a delicate interrogation about her background and intentions. "So, Sarah," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Jake tells me you're from back east originally. What brought you all the way out here?" Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, but she had learned to fight her own battles. "Circumstances," she replied evenly. "Sometimes life takes you places you never expected to go." "Indeed," Michael continued, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. "And what are your plans? Do you intend to make your home here permanently?" The question was loaded with implication, and Sarah felt the familiar anger rising that she had learned to control during her marriage. But this was different. This time she had the right and the power to respond as she saw fit. "My plans on my own business," she said calmly. meeting Michael's gaze directly. As are my intentions and my relationship with your brother. Jake reached over and took her hand, a gesture of support that wasn't lost on his brother. Sarah is exactly where she wants to be, he said firmly. And so am I. Michael's visit stretched on for a week, during which he made increasingly obvious attempts to convince Jake that Sarah was unsuitable and that the ranch was a dead end. He painted pictures of the sophisticated life Jake could have in the city, the important people he could meet, the money he could make in land development. You're 35 years old, Jake, Michael said one evening as the three of them sat on the front porch. Don't you think it's time you stopped playing cowboy and became a real success? The insult to everything Jake valued hit its mark, and Sarah saw her lover's jaw clench with controlled anger. But before he could respond, she spoke up with a quiet fury that surprised them all. Success is building something meaningful with your life, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Success is treating people with respect and dignity. Success is having the courage to live according to your own values instead of someone else's expectations. By any measure that matters, your brother is more successful than anyone I've ever met. Michael looked taken aback by her passionate defense of Jake, and for the first time since his arrival, he seemed to really see her rather than dismissing her as an obstacle to his plans. Jake squeezed her hand gratefully, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but absolutely final. Michael, I appreciate your concern, but my life is exactly what I want it to be. Sarah and I are building something here together, and we don't need anyone's approval or permission to do it. Michael left the next morning, clearly frustrated by his failure to change his brother's mind. As his carriage disappeared down the dusty road, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. I'm sorry about that, Jake said as they watched his brother leave. Michael means well, but he's never understood what this place means to me. You don't have to apologize for standing up for what you believe in, Sarah replied. That's one of the things I love most about you. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and both of them froze as the significance of what she had said sank in. It was the first time either of them had spoken the word love aloud, though the emotion had been growing between them for weeks. Jake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense with emotion. Do you mean that? He asked quietly. Sarah felt a moment of panic, the old fear of vulnerability rising up to choke her. But looking into Jake's face, seeing the hope and tenderness there, she found the courage to speak her truth. Yes, she whispered. I love you, Jake Morrison. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see the world. I love this place you've built and the life you've offered to share with me. Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I love you too, Sarah, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You've brought light into corners of my life I didn't even realize were dark. They held each other as the sun climbed higher over the desert, both of them crying tears of joy and relief. The declaration of love felt like crossing a bridge they could never go back over, committing themselves to a future they would build together. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Jake took Sarah's hand and led her to his room instead of leaving her at the door of the guest room as he had every night before. The question in his eyes was clear, and Sarah answered it by following him without hesitation. Their first night together as lovers was everything Sarah had never dared to dream intimacy could be. Jake worshipped her body with a reverence that made her feel like a goddess rather than a convenience, taking time to learn what brought her pleasure and celebrating every response he could coax from her. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood what it meant to be made love to rather than simply used, and the experience left her feeling powerful and beautiful and completely whole. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, Sarah traced patterns on Jake's chest with her fingertips. I never knew it could be like this, she whispered against his skin. Jake tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It's like this because we love each other, he said softly. Because we trust each other. Because you're safe to be yourself with me. Sarah lifted her head to look at him, seeing her own wonder and contentment reflected in his face. I used to think love was something that happened to you, she said. Something you had no control over. But this feels like something we're choosing to create together. That's exactly what it is, Jake agreed. And we'll keep choosing it every day for the rest of our lives. The promise in his words filled Sarah with a joy so complete it was almost overwhelming. She had traveled from desperation to hope, from fear to trust, from survival to love. And now, lying in the arms of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, she understood that her journey was really just beginning. Outside their window, the desert stretched away under a blanket of stars, vast and beautiful and full of promise. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself drift toward sleep, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the kind of life she had never dared to dream possible. 6 months after Sarah had first asked Jake to take her to town, she stood in the same guest room where she had spent her first night at the Three Rivers Ranch. But everything had changed. The room that had once represented temporary shelter now served as her office, where she spent her mornings teaching reading and writing to the children from nearby ranches who came to the house 3 times a week. The bookshelves Jake had built for her lined the walls, filled with volumes she had accumulated through careful saving and generous gift from her students' grateful parents. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting the simple blue dress that Jake had brought her from his last trip to town. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate, broken creature who had stumbled out of the desert all those months ago. This woman had bright, clear eyes, sun-kissed skin, and, most importantly, the confident bearing of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted from life. Today was special. Today, Jake had asked her to accompany him to town on business, but Sarah suspected his motives went deeper than the cattle sale he claimed to need her help with. There had been something different about him lately, a nervous energy that she recognized but couldn't quite place. She had caught him in deep conversation with Tom several times, conversations that stopped abruptly when she appeared. Whatever he was planning, she was content to let it unfold in its own time. The ride to town was comfortable and familiar now. Sarah sat beside Jake on the wagon seat, her hand resting naturally on his thigh as they talked about the ranch, her students, and their plans for the upcoming winter. The easy intimacy between them had grown steadily over the months, built on thousands of small moments of shared work, laughter, and love. Mrs. Henderson says young Tommy is reading at a level 3 grades above his age, Sarah told Jake proudly. She wants to know if I think he's ready for more advanced books. Jake smiled, his pride in her accomplishments evident in his expression. What do you think? I think he's ready for anything he wants to tackle, Sarah replied. He reminds me of myself at that age, hungry for every story he can get his hands on. I've been thinking about starting a lending library, maybe getting some of the other ranches to contribute books so all the children have access to more reading material. That's a wonderful idea, Jake said warmly. Have you talked to anyone else about it? Mrs. Patterson mentioned it to the ladies' circle in town. They're very interested in helping. Some of them have offered to donate books, and others want to help with fundraising for new ones. Jake nodded thoughtfully. You've become quite the leader in this community, you know. People respect you. Trust your judgment. Sarah felt a flush of pleasure at his words. The acceptance she had found among the ranch families had been one of the most healing aspects of her new life. These were good people who judged her by her actions rather than her past, who had welcomed her into their community without reservation once they saw her dedication to their children's education. Town was busier than usual when they arrived, with several ranch families gathered for the weekly cattle sale. Sarah was greeted warmly by people she had come to consider friends, women who sought her advice on everything from teaching their children to managing household accounts, men who tipped their hats respectfully and asked after her students' progress. While Jake conducted his business at the stockyards, Sarah visited the general store to pick up supplies for her makeshift school. Mrs. Murphy, the store owner's wife, had become a particular friend and supporter of Sarah's educational efforts. I've got something special for you, Mrs. Murphy said excitedly, producing a package wrapped in brown paper. My sister in Sacramento sent these. She thought your students might enjoy them. Inside the package were a dozen brand new children's books, their colorful covers bright and inviting. Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth binding, thinking of how her students' faces would light up when they saw these treasures. They're beautiful, she breathed. Please tell your sister how grateful I am. I will indeed. She's a teacher too, at one of the schools in the city. She says what you're doing out here is just as important as anything happening in the big schools. Maybe more important, since these children wouldn't have any chance at education otherwise. The validation meant more to Sarah than she could express. Teaching her small group of ranch children had given her a sense of purpose she had never known before, but Sometimes she wondered if what she was doing really mattered in the larger scheme of things. To know that other educators respected her work filled her with pride and determination to do even better. She was carefully packing the books when Jake appeared at her side. His business concluded earlier than expected. There was something in his expression that made her look at him more closely, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that set her heart racing. "Ready to head home?" he asked, but there was an odd formality in his tone that wasn't like him. "Of course," Sarah replied, gathering her packages. "How did the sale go?" "Better than expected," Jake said, offering his arm as they walked toward the wagon. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd like to take a little detour on the way home. There's something I want to show you." Sarah agreed readily, curious about what had put that particular light in Jake's eyes. Instead of heading directly back to the ranch, he turned the wagon toward the hills that rose to the east of town, following a narrow track that Sarah had never seen before. They climbed steadily for about 20 minutes until they reached a plateau that overlooked the entire valley. The view was breathtaking, endless miles of desert and mountains stretching away under the vast blue sky, with the green ribbon of the river marking their ranch's location far below. Jake helped Sarah down from the wagon and led her to a flat boulder that provided the perfect vantage point. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them awed by the beauty spread out before them. "I used to come here when I was a boy," Jake said eventually. "Whenever life felt too complicated or confusing, I'd ride up here and think. This is where I decided I wanted to spend my life ranching, where I planned out how I'd expand the operation, where I'd build a house, everything." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, understanding that he was sharing something deeply personal with her. "It's perfect. I can see why this place would inspire big dreams." Jake was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. When he spoke again, his voice was soft but intense. "This is also where I realized I was in love with you. I came up here about a month after you arrived, trying to figure out what was happening to me. I'd sit here and think about your smile, the way you looked when you were reading, how right it felt to have you in my house and in my life." Sarah turned to look at him, touched by the confession. "Why didn't you tell me then?" "Because I was scared," Jake admitted honestly. "Scared you'd run if you knew how I felt. Scared I'd destroy the trust we were building. Scared you'd think I was trying to trap you the way your husband did." The reference to her past no longer caused Sarah pain the way it once had. That part of her life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a sad story about a woman who no longer existed. "I wouldn't have run," she said quietly. "By then, I was already falling in love with you too. I was just afraid to admit it to myself." Jake stood suddenly, pulling her up with him. His face was serious, almost solemn, as he looked down at her. "Sarah, there's something I need to ask you, and I want you to feel completely free to say no if you're not ready." Sarah's heart began to pound as she realized what was coming. Jake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single, perfectly clear diamond. "Sarah Elizabeth," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my best friend for the rest of my life?" Sarah stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the moment she had dreamed of but never dared to expect. The diamond caught the afternoon light and threw it back in brilliant sparks, beautiful, but not nearly as beautiful as the love shining in Jake's eyes. "Yes," she whispered then louder. "Yes, Jake, yes. Nothing in this world would make me happier." Jake's face broke into the widest smile Sarah had ever seen as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and Sarah realized he must have gotten her size by borrowing one of her other rings. The thought of him planning this moment so carefully made her heart swell with love. They kissed there on the plateau, with the whole world spread out below them, and Sarah felt as if she were flying. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not just the absence of pain, but the presence of joy so complete it seemed to fill every cell in her body. "When?" she asked breathlessly when they finally broke apart. "Whenever you want," Jake replied. "Tomorrow, next month, next year. I'll wait as long as you need." Sarah laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. "What about next month? That would give us time to plan something nice, invite the people who matter to us." "Perfect," Jake agreed, spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. "Mrs. Sarah Morrison has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" The name sent a thrill through Sarah that had nothing to do with taking a man's identity, and everything to do with claiming her place as Jake's equal partner in life. This marriage would be nothing like her first one. It would be built on love, respect, and shared dreams rather than duty and fear. As they drove home in the gathering twilight, Sarah's hand clasped in Jake's. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who had begged for a ride to town was gone forever, replaced by someone strong, confident, and deeply loved. She had found not just a home, but a purpose, not just safety, but joy, not just survival, but a life worth living. The Three Rivers Ranch came into view as they crested the final hill, its windows glowing warmly in the dusk. Tom and the other hand were gathered on the front porch, and Sarah realized with a start that Jake must have told them about his plans. As the wagon pulled into the yard, the men broke into cheers and applause, their faces beaming with genuine happiness for their boss and his bride-to-be. "Congratulations, Miss Sarah," Tom called out, his weathered face creased in a grin. Couldn't happen to two finer people. The celebration that followed was impromptu, but heartfelt, with one of the hands producing a harmonica and another fetching a bottle of whiskey that Jake had been saving for special occasions. They danced in the yard under the stars. Sarah passed from one partner to another as the ranch hands took turns congratulating her and welcoming her officially into their extended family. Later, as the evening wound down and the hands drifted off to their quarters, Sarah and Jake sat together on their front porch, planning their future with the easy familiarity of people who had already chosen to share their lives. "I want to keep teaching," Sarah said, her hand resting on Jake's chest as they discussed their hopes for marriage. "Of course," Jake replied immediately. "The children need you, and you need them. Besides, I fell in love with a teacher, not a decoration for my parlor." Sarah smiled at his words, knowing he meant them completely. This man would never ask her to diminish herself to make him feel more important. Instead, he would help her become everything she was capable of being. As the night grew quiet around them, Sarah realized that her story had come full circle. She had begun this journey asking someone to take her to town, desperate to escape a life that offered nothing but pain. Now she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the kind of life she had never dared to dream possible. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly as they settled in for the night. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of home, her hand secure in Jake's, her future bright with possibility. She was no longer running from something or desperately searching for something. She had found it all right here: love, purpose, belonging, and the chance to become the woman she was always meant to be. The journey that had begun in desperation had led her to a joy so complete it took her breath away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new adventures, but tonight Sarah Morrison to be was exactly where she belonged, home.